Hi, I'm Geoff Davis, and I'm here to talk to you about handwork and why it's important and relevant today. I taught in the public schools in Carmel for 15 years, and then I moved to IPS and taught there for the next 18 years. And a lot of people ask, why would I leave Carmel schools, affluent schools, or close to my home, and go to teach in poor and struggling schools? And I went to IPS to teach at a very specific school for a very specific program, and that was the Key Learning Community. The Key Learning Community was the bright spot in IPS at that time. The program was project-based, and we talked to students about their passions and their interests. We constructed curriculum around those needs. We integrated the core subjects into themes. It was an exciting place to be. It's where teaching was done right. It's really important to me, and it always has been important to me, to bring handwork and authenticity to the classroom. Handwork is important because children like to make things. To be successful, school must be interesting and engaging to students. Authenticity is important because learning is only relevant when we're doing real work that relates to the world beyond the classroom. I taught in a multi-age classroom, and in my classroom we built boats, we restored, built, and played musical instruments, we built structures, real structures, from wood and from inflatable plastic bags. When we read the Phantom Toll Booth, we built a toll booth in the classroom, or in the hallway. The students and the teachers flourished. Flash forward to 8 of the last 10 years I was teaching, everything had changed. I was discouraged from bringing authenticity to the classroom. I was discouraged from taking time out of what some people believe to be serious learning to bring fun and meaning and authenticity to my students' experience. It was a miserable time for me and my students. 5th and 6th grade students who I once handed hammers, power saws, drills, and knives were now struggling with glue sticks and scissors. Why? Why had this happened in those years? Well, a lot of it had to do with I-STEP and statewide accountability for grades, or statewide grades for schools, accountability grades. In response for statewide accountability and a call for measurable standards, schools panicked. They turned away from innovative and successful programs, what we knew were best practices, and instruction became prescribed and scripted. Almost all instruction now focused on reading, language, and math, the only 3 disciplines that were measured on I-STEP and for statewide school grades. As a result, students lost touch with the benefits of cutting and pasting and using saws and screwdrivers and using their hands to learn and explore. Parenting had changed too. For a number of reasons, kids weren't playing and exploring as they once did at home. I'm not here today to fight I-STEP or statewide school accountability or the way parents are doing their jobs at home. I fought those battles on other fronts. The examples I'm going to bring to you today come from my classrooms and my experiences. It's about motivation, it's about problem solving, and it's about learning. These are about my experience with students in the classroom. But I'm also speaking to all of you. Your quality of life, your ability to solve problems, and the way you feel about yourself are all tied to what you make and what you do with your hands. First, I want to talk to you about tradition. There are 2 assumptions that we can make when we're talking about handwork and tradition. The first is that all human beings seek to make connections. And the second is that human beings feel a need to leave a legacy. In the context of handwork and tradition, we seek things from the past, and we make connections to those. In context of handwork and tradition, we seek things from the past to make connections to those who came before us. We take those ideas or skills or objects or whatever they are, and we make them our own, and we adapt them. Then we pass these things on to make connections with our children, our offspring, and the people that are yet to come. Handwork is very closely tied to tradition. An example that resonates with me today is my grandmother's macaroni and cheese. Food waste, the traditions of preparing and preserving food, are traditions of handwork. We know that generations of people have worked in fields and kitchens, growing, preparing, and serving food. They always have, and they always will. My grandmother's macaroni and cheese recipe is delicious, but I don't think it's anything special. It's macaroni, cheese, milk, eggs, breadcrumbs, and a smidge of something unexpected. My grandmother learned to make this macaroni and cheese from her mother, and we can presume that she learned to make it from her mother. Recipes and other ideas don't rise in a vacuum. They're adapted from ideas and recipes that already exist, made your own, and they evolve over years and years. Knowing this recipe well and visiting German restaurants, I came to the realization that my grandmother's macaroni and cheese was actually an adaptation of baked Spaetzle and cheese, a German dish. Now this connection means even more to me. Knowing that this goes back to Germany and my German ancestors, it causes me to pause and reflect and think about a woman walking into a grocery store or a market in southeast Pennsylvania and wondering how she can adapt the North American offerings to prepare the offerings of food that she knows and her family loves. This is one of the many ways that foodway traditions are adopted, adapted, and passed on. My children now have this recipe, this tradition, and they carry it forward. They both prepare my macaroni and cheese for their family and their friends. This recipe has been passed down through ancestors in Germany, through me, and now as my daughters, and they've made it their own. You all have similar traditions in your families. Those are the things that are served at holiday meals that your grandmothers made, and they learned from their mothers or their grandparents. These things are important and powerful. But it isn't just about foodways. This is true of all the traditional arts that we learn in our families. It's about knitting and quilting, and even your handwriting, the way you trim the hedges and the way you mow your lawn. Anything that we do with our hands that comes from our family traditions and is passed forward is a tradition. We're going to talk a little bit more about foodways. We can all relate to food, right? Handwork builds community. Imagine the many times that we gather, church dinners, county fairs, reunions. It always includes food. Why? Because handwork, in this case food, is closely tied to our shared tradition. Our shared traditions tie us together, and human beings seek these connections and want to leave a legacy. I want to talk about that something special about making something yourself. I struggle with what to call this aspect of handwork. It's that something that sets handwork on a higher plane than other endeavors, or many other endeavors. For the sake of discussion, I'm simply going to call it that something, and I think you'll understand. One of my first understandings of that something was when about 20 years ago, when I came across a book by J.J. Lanks. J.J. Lanks was the printmaker that illustrated the poems of Robert Frost. In fact, he was one of Robert Frost's neighbors and one of his best friends. In 1932, he wrote a book called The Woodcut Manual about the processes of making woodcuts. It's an interesting book, but when I got to the afterword, I was blown away by what he had to say about creativity and handwork. I'm going to paraphrase. He talks about human beings as creators. He explains that the earliest humans had to rely on their hands and their creativity in order to survive. The earliest people had to create shelter or they perished. They had to create their clothing or they perished. They had to find ways to prepare prepare food or they perished. Over those tens of thousands of years of human development, it became very apparent that we were already hardwired to create. He goes on to talk about urbanization and the migration of rural laborers to the city market or city factories. And this is powerful. To interfere with the creative urge is to invite trouble. To interfere with the creative urge is to invite trouble. The man that tightens bolts all day long in an assembly of the standardized article of commerce is being cheated of his birthright. He cannot make something in his spare time away from if he cannot make something in his spare time away from the factory, he's on the fair way of becoming a nuisance or a menace to society. I could spend a great deal of time talking about the implications of that today. And he goes on, and I'm going to include this more because it was funny, but it also is relevant. Children have the urge to make things, and we all know that. When children are born, they make things. Children have the urge to make things until their sensible parents discourage them for a substitute as early as possible in life, such as knocking a ball into the hole with the least number of strokes. So the 1932 video game and TV excuse, right? I might have. Also, that's part of that something is ownership. I'm not talking about owning the objects that we create. I'm talking about owning the skills, the story, and the context in which they are created. I've worn these leather suspenders every day since I made them over 5 years ago. I made them because I saw a pair online and couldn't justify spending $200 on a pair of suspenders. So I figured out how to make them, and it wasn't hard. My skills as a woodworker and as a woodcarver transferred to leatherwork quickly. I made them to wear on a canoe trip. That was the trip of my life. I spent 6 weeks alone in a canoe traveling through the northern forests of New England and southern Canada. And I managed to move a canoe and 200 pounds of gear over 420 miles alone. These suspenders are just leather and brass, and I could teach you to make them in less than an hour. But it's not the suspenders that are important. It's the story. I own that story. And I wear these and carry that story with me. That's powerful and that's important. I'm sure you can think of similar handmade objects in your home and in your lives. It's often not just the object that has value, it's that something, it's the context. Also, for many people, that something is spiritual or religious. In many of our belief systems, our hand skills and creativity are considered gifts from God. And our work is a reflection of his or her power in our lives. For many, that's powerful and that's important. There's a really powerful connection between the brain and learning and the hands. Think back to when you were first learning about numbers. Your teacher didn't hand you a calculator or a pencil. You were given objects. Blocks, counters, sticks. And you began with the concrete and you worked to the abstract. When we begin with the concrete, we use our hands to hold, handle, and manipulate objects. We begin by giving a student a single object, and then two, and then three. We assign numbers to these objects. We pair sets with the same value. We take objects away. We add objects to those sets. Only through manipulation and trial and error, comparisons, and pattern finding with our hands do we develop number sets. Then we move on to the abstract. That's how learning works. Maria Montessori had something to say about this. He does it with his hands by experience, first in play and then through work. The hands are the instrument of man's intelligence. I spent the last 2 years of my teaching career teaching 6th grade in a Montessori school. Concrete manipulatives are important instructional materials, even in 6th grade, upper elementary and middle school. But also during those 2 years, I found that my students were very reluctant to take notes, to show work, or to write anything down. And I don't think they avoided this work because they were lazy. They avoided it because it was hard. Much harder than hoping that they could learn by rote. Now, we talked about the brain-to-hand connection when learning and moving from the concrete to the abstract, but it also information's transferred the other way. In order for students to learn, they have to critically think about what they've learned, and then they have to write or create something with their hands. I taught with an older teacher and for many years, and she would talk about building pathways in the brain. And I think that's a good analogy. The pathways we develop when reading or learning by rote or simply pondering an idea are important. But the strongest pathways we develop are when a student has to think critically and use their hands to develop a way to symbolize this idea on paper or through a model or through a project. Hands are critical to this. Most teachers would agree that when students take classroom notes on paper, they retain information much better than the students that don't. Even taking notes on a computer or tablet does not have the same cognitive benefits of writing things down on paper. Writing those spelling words 5 times each or writing out long division problems is painful, but it works to build those pathways. There's a rising trend in note-taking right now that I find encouraging. Students are being encouraged to develop pictures, symbols, and color codes within their notes. In fact, while I was writing this presentation, I got stuck several times, and the solution was always to go to the wall and pull down chart paper, grab a bunch of markers, and draw my way back out of that problem. When I taught at the Key Learning Community, we worked with Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi from the University of Chicago. He's a brain scientist. And he would come and help us at school work directly with the children through using his flow theory. Every creative person has experienced the state of flow. I've had a basic awareness since I was a child, but I had no way to talk about it or understand it. The state of flow is that state where you lose awareness of your needs and wants. You're so consumed with what you're doing. You lose track of time or even where you are, and the task at hand and your thoughts are all that you know. It's no surprise to me that most people most easily reach flow theory when they're working with their hands. When people are in this state, their minds become sponges, ideas flow, and problems are solved as part of the process, and deep critical thinking occurs. We had a flow classroom at the Key School, which was a special like gym or art or music. And in flow class, the students would explore various activities to find out what stimulated flow in them. As teachers, we'd use that data to inform our instruction that led to flow in the classroom and intrinsically motivating activities. Play and unrestricted exploration are also important parts of that brain-to-hand connection. Geoffrey Davis, in his book, 50 Dangerous Things to Do with Children, advises children to play with fire and knives and to throw rocks, all hand-centric activities. He writes in his foreword, I argue that not doing these things is ultimately a more dangerous proposition of ourselves and society. These activities offer real ways to encounter phenomena firsthand and provide opportunities to make careful observations and generate new questions. These activities are often the most powerful in terms of cognitive development, but unfortunately these types of behaviors are seldom endorsed in our schools, street corners, or our homes. When a child plays with fire, they learn a lot. How long does it take for a stick to catch fire? A marshmallow. Do sticks ignite faster when they're placed above or below the coals? What things burn? What things don't? These are important things to know, and these are not things that are being taught in a classroom. Some of our most important learning comes from play. Later in the book, Geoffrey Davis talks about competence. He describes that someone with competence is able to look at a problem and craft a solution, treats failure as feedback, and sees obstacles as puzzles. This kind of competence, the kind of competence that we hope for ourselves and our children, come from years and years of playing and informal exploration. Years of trying tools and materials, years of failure, years of regrouping and adapting, years of developing and testing more abstract and more complex ideas, years of handwork. Folks are craving opportunities to learn with their hands. Maker spaces are popping up everywhere. Last September, I had the pleasure to have a 3-month term as a maker in residence at Ignite Makerspace, the Fisher's Library. I moved my entire studio into the space, 7 pickup truck loads, and I set up my shop. During that time, we built ukuleles, we carved birds, fish, and whales, and folks looked on. They asked questions, they attended workshops, they attended lessons. We culminated the experience by building a pair of 6-foot bent ash toboggans. This project involved over 70 folks of all ages, some visiting, some observing, and a handful throwing themselves completely into the 2-day project. Talk about the power of handwork to build community. During the time I spent at the Fishers, I became close to a number of families. In fact, some are here today. The kids were frustrated. Shop class and industrial arts and home economic classes had been cut from their schools and were no longer offered. Homeschooling families wanted their students to have opportunities for their children to build and strengthen hand skills, but the options were limited. Since I returned to my Noblesville studio, I've developed programming for middle school and high school students. Classes began just 2 weeks ago, and the students are enthusiastically engaged. Their parents have become involved too. We're building hand skills as we build toolboxes for the students to carry. It is so great to have a wood shop packed with young folks and having a great time and wanting to learn what I have to teach. I can only imagine what they will do with these skills when they begin their careers and their families, but I'm confident they will take what I've taught them, make it their own, and pass it forward. I challenge you to seek out ways that you can engage people in handwork and in your traditions and teach that so they can pass that forward. It's great to finally, after those 10 miserable years, to be teaching again. Thank you very much.